Hello, everybody. Sorry it's been a while since we've had a podcast. We've had all kinds of family and contingencies and emergencies and everything in the world that kind of came upon all of us at once. Not together, but in our own families and things that we've done. Today, Matt is out. Brenna had to have some surgery that was done, something that was planned. And so far, things are going pretty well. And at any rate, we hadn't been able to come around and have the podcast. So I'm here today by myself because, like I said, Matt had to go and tend to Brenna. So we'll try to make this short and sweet and to the point and get back on track a little bit. We've been in 1 Corinthians. And I really worked back to try to figure out how we actually got started in Corinthians. I'm sure there was some kind of genius behind it, but I couldn't remember what it was. But the point of that was to give a little context. So it's been I think we've missed 2 Fridays, almost 3, I guess. Remember when we got into Corinthians, though, the church at Corinth had evidently sent him letters asking questions, and he sends a letter back, and he's really kind of chiding them pretty hard. And we've talked about all this, and the relevance in it is that this book and some others are kind of given in traditional and typical church functions as this is how you live and work in the church, because he answers a lot of questions. And as he answers them, we just kind of back off and we go, okay, well, that's scriptural authority. Well, it is scriptural authority, but you also have to look at the story and see what's going on in there. He hits them pretty hard, and he's kind of being sarcastic with them in terms of these are the things you're doing. And in chapter 10, which is where we got about halfway through chapter 10 before, and I'm going to try to finish that out today before we get into chapter 11, which is really kind of ironic because at the top of chapter 11, he says, so you guys imitate the way that I do things. Well, in all these chapters that we're talking about right here, he's talking about how he sees things and does things and works through things. So don't miss that part. And in some of these things, he says, well, this is what the Lord says to do. And then in other parts, he says, well, but this is kind of my opinion, or this is what I would do. Don't miss those parts. And we've said that from a, what's the word I'm looking for? From a doctrinal point of view, people say, well, yeah, he's saying that's his opinion, but he didn't realize he was writing the Bible. And so, he just didn't realize how inspired he was to write those things. So what he says is an opinion. That's the kingdom. That's what it is. I'm not really arguing that point. But what I'm saying is that you want to imitate Paul. Look at what he's doing. And he's taking, in terms of, he's well-versed in the Bible. He's well-versed in the stories. And he's taking those things and applying them to what happens daily, because those are the kind of questions that they were writing. And I think, well, I find myself in those conditions all the time. And so we know this because he chastises them really hard about taking sides. And this is about maturity. Well, we've been talking about that through all this. This is about maturity and where you are in that maturity functions. For some reason in human tendencies, we assume that if you go to a 10-minute class on something, now you're an expert and everything comes into all of your nature and mannerisms and thoughts and actions are now versed and you're going to be an expert at doing them. Well, that's not really how it happens. But at the same time, these people must have been fairly well trained, so to speak. They had church life, they had all that. Remember, their culture is immoral to the first order, probably way more than what we see things as immoral that we're going through now. But he chastises them and basically tells them, you should know this stuff. You're better than that. And in chapter 7, he switches gears and he says, okay, so I've told you all this stuff. Now let me answer some of the questions that you sent. And he talked about abstaining from sexual relationships. And specifically, the scripture says man not it's good for a man not to touch a woman. That's kind of how it states in Greek. And then he talks about other things, the unyoked marriage. That's a fancy church term. Don't be or don't be yoked unequally, would be kind of the old King James way of saying it. And but what he says is he's given the culture, and these people didn't know that. You got new converts, and then you got people that are following the pagans, and then there were also Jewish tradition around. So they had a big hodgepodge there. And he's saying, if you're unyoked, in other words, the spouse is a believer and the other spouse is not a believer, he talks about how do you work through that. He talks about your status and your walk. This is all in chapter 7. If you're saved, you don't have to become something else. In terms of, if you were a slave and you got saved, that doesn't mean you get to go pound the desk and say that I'm free and leave. He says live under that circumstance until you can get out of it. He uses terminology like, if you're not circumcised, he says, don't worry about that. Live as an uncircumcised individual, but live under the things that you're learning in the kingdom, because that status doesn't mean anything. In the bigger picture of that, where Paul's coming from versus where they're at, and we're talking about rules and regulations here. We're actually going to talk about some other stuff about that when Matt gets back, in comparative things that you would probably know about. But here I'll call it the lower echelon, the function where you're learning Christianity and you're reading these things and you're taking them literally. Nothing wrong with that. But Paul's throwing out these directions, not so much that, okay, don't do it like that, do it like this. He's trying to tell them, look at the totality of what's going on here. And the point is that Paul is describing things, how God measures you. He knows that you have to take steps and learn things, and then you get the bigger picture. And you may do things very rule-oriented and function, nothing wrong with that. But at some point, you're going to be able to see, wait a minute, there's something more to this than what it is. We beat this horse to death. But the point of it, what he's trying to get at in chapter 7 is free yourself from concern of worldly issues. And if you're trying to put your religion on the way the religion tells you to do it, that's a worldly concern. You're trying to do it how other people are going to measure you, and that's not how God's messing with it. So in chapter 7, that's kind of the function of it. He wants to free you from worldly concern. And when he talks about wives and that kind of thing, if you're married and your spouse dies, well, it would be better if you didn't get married again, because if you do, you're concerning yourself with your spouse and all that. That's the way it was intended to be, but in the bigger picture, he's trying to free you up and say, so just do the things that you want to do for God or what God has for you. In chapter 8, he kind of keeps going on that with different things. He's talking about eating meat that were sacrificed to idols. He talks about what he does is he's observant with the people he's with. If he's got people that do things a certain way, he'll try to identify with them without sinning, to be there so he can present the gospel. But he's still talking about freedom and the responsibility of freedom. And that's what he meant by don't be concerned with the worldly issues. But in chapter 8, he touches on other things, and he talks about eating in terms of what religion would tell you to do or not do. And he talks about intellect. Just because you got a high intellect, don't be thinking too highly of yourself in that. And he's going to touch on that again in chapter 10. And then in chapter 9, he's talking about your freedom related to what's going on in religion, as in your church and where you're at, and you got to be sensitive to those things. And he talks about at the end of chapter 9, the reason that I go and proclaim the gospel is because I'm compelled to do it. I can understand that to a certain degree. I'm not good at anything else. I do things to make money for my family. I do all that kind of stuff. But what I really want to be doing is doing ministerial work. And so I get frustrated with all the other stuff. Not the people I'm dealing with, just the situation as it is. And so then he comes into chapter 10 and he's still talking about all this stuff, the relevance, the freedom, the rules and those kind of things. And in the first part of this, we talked about chapter 10, but I'm going to recap just a little bit on that. So in the very beginning of it, well, I'll just read it. How about that? And I'm going to go through it quick here. And I'm going to read it in the New Living Translation. So he says, I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. Now, he's not talking to just Jews. He's talking to Gentiles that have gone, that have converted. But what he's talking about is his brothers and sisters, and you could say in Christ, the kingdom people, right? He says, don't forget about these brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. All of them ate the same spiritual food, manna, and all of them drank from the same spiritual water, for they drank from a spiritual rock that traveled with them. That rock was Christ. And so the point of it is he's saying, all this stuff that you're going through, you have somebody to identify with. They're going through these changes. They're seeing this stuff. They're having all the same emotional stuff. And I titled it as Historic Kingdom Relevance, because it's easy to go, that's what they went through. That's not what we're dealing with now. He wouldn't have brought that up if that wasn't the case. And he says, in verse 5, he says, and yet God was not pleased with most of them. They all saw the same things, and they were all, I would tell you that they were all equally struck with spiritual awe. The cloud came, remember, they're in the desert, so they got this big, thick cloud, and it helped block the sun from a practical point of view in the day. And at night, it kept things kind of lit up so that they could see. And it was a covering, right? And covering's a whole other thing we'll talk about some other time. And they literally had a rock that was following them around that was gushing out water. And so it was water, you take a drink of it, but how it was coming and all that was kind of awe-inspiring, right? And they understood all that. But they got used to those things. And then it says in verse 5, yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, these people were saved by God. Are you saying, Tim, that they were saved and they're kept in heaven? Well, I would tell you that they were, but that's an arguable point. These things happened as a warning to us, so that we would not crave evil things as they did. Now, it's real important to grab that in verse 6. Paul says, in the New American Standard, in that same verse, now these things happened as examples for us. So he's talking about something that happened way in the past, and the things that they went through were done by God for us right now. It's not a metaphor. God was thinking that far ahead. Well, why would he put them through all that kind of stuff? Isn't that kind of cruel? Well, I don't know. You probably have to have that conversation with God. And that's not the first time that he's done it. In that conversation, I would tell you the book of Job. That's one of the few places that you get to see something transpiring in heaven that we can't see. And the results of that conversation, he has a conversation with Satan. And Job, who is a righteous man, confessed by God himself, goes through some horrible tragedies that most of us can't even measure. And at the end of that thing, if you're just looking at it myopically, we've been talking about this, right? So if you just look at the book of Job, there's all kinds of books written about Job, and I've read a lot of them. And it talks about, well, Job learned this, and Job could have done better if he did that, and Job could have this, that, and the other. Well, we already know that he was a righteous man by God's own mouth. So everything that he went through in that, on a micro scale, was probably for Job, but on a, is it macro for the bigger picture? Yeah, so for the macro scale, I was talking to Sean. For the macro scale, talking to the entity in the room. Sorry, I digress. On the macro scale, which is the big picture, Job went through what he went through for you and I right here, right now. God was looking that far ahead to show what it looks like and the battles with Satan and all that kind of stuff and how they don't overcome for the one that's pursuing the Lord. Paul's got that big picture in his head, and he's trying to bring these people up to the same level. And he's not trying to, it's happening. And you can sense his frustration. It's probably not happening quite as fast as he'd like it to happen, but even he knows it's going to transpire, right? And so all these things happen as a warning to us so that we would not crave the evil things that they did. Man, is that powerful, or it is to me. And that's kind of how I've learned how to study in these regards. I'm looking at all the things that transpired, and I've come to a point in my life through all the study that I've done and the research I've done and all my own failures and such of those kind of things. When I read the things in the Old Testament, I see exactly what's happening now, people that they do and how that we work and what we do. We're not dealing with anything that's new. And to me, that gives me comfort. Some people look at it and go, well, that's kind of boring. That's not how you need to look at it. So verses 1 through 11, it's this historical kingdom relevance thing, right? He's pulling something from the past, dropping it in the table, and it doesn't matter. Oh, well, that's just for the Jews. No. It's for all of us because God took us and kept us and saved us, and here we are. So pay attention to what happened where God was working with what he called his people, because we're his people now. And then verses 12 through 13, he says all that because of the arguments he's been having in the prior books here, right? And we keep coming back to their arguing over, am I Paul or Apollos? Well, that's really an intellectual stance. And you're trying to prove your point, right? And you're using one of them to prove the point because they're obviously a powerhouse of some sort. And then he talks about these people that went through the wilderness and they thought all the same stuff. And what I didn't read in here is in some of the scraps where they mocked God and basically, and they said, well, we know better than this. And when they got all stressed out, they started doing the things they'd seen before. This is the cultural part, right? They built their own idol and started worshiping and doing things that were just absolutely repulsive in the eyes of God, almost just to throw it up in his face and mocking. After what had happened transpired, it was a great thing. The cloud, the rock of water, all that stuff. And a lot of them got killed. It says 23,000 in one day were wiped out over the sexual immorality things that they did. And don't miss all that. Oh, well, I shouldn't do sexual immorality. Well, of course you shouldn't do sexual immorality. But sometimes learning where that sexual immorality line is the thing, and then learning how to be changed and transformed out of that, even though the culture around you is still doing it and driving you to do it. I mean, we're living in it right now, right? It's kind of an off-the-wall example. I'm putting a new place together, and I put in a solar array out there, right? I'm kind of hard-headed and buck the system on occasion. And it was going to cost me the same money to get power over there as it was to get a solar array set up over there. So I took the solar array route. And I had somebody come over the other day and they said, oh, this is so great. You're really helping the earth and all that. And I stopped them and I said, and I'm not trying to rub anybody wrong here, tell you how you ought to think. I'm just telling you where I'm at. And I said, let me stop you right there. I'm not doing any of this to save the planet or save the world, because I don't think all that is really that big a deal. And that's from an eternal point of view, not trying to change your mind or any of that. But I said it works well and it's efficient. And as long as you put it in right and all that, it covers all the issues. And in the end, I'm going to have something that when I do bring power in here and all the lights go up for some reason, I'm still going to have capacity to do it. It was just a prudent issue to me. Whatever my side feelings are and all that are not really of point. But the culture says all of this, you have to do these things to save the earth. And my mindset is completely against that. Not that you go trash the earth. Good stewardship is the function. But that's not what made my mind up to pursue the solar, if that makes sense. And so that's just a function of, and I'm not trying to rebel against the culture. I just looked at something that works well, and I know it works well, and I know how to put it in. So I brought it in, but it wasn't from being pressured from the outside of something else. And I'm not putting myself on a pedestal and telling you I know how to stand against things. But that's exactly what he's saying right here is if you think you're the man, be careful how you stand up, which brings us into chapter 13 or verse 13 that says, and this one is misconstrued in all kinds of ways in church culture, the temptations in your life are no different than what others experienced, right? We just talked about those others. And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. There's a little stronger language in that when you read it in King James or the New American Standard, but that's where we say, well, this can't be a temptation from God because it wouldn't be this big of a struggle. That's not what it says. Even Job was probably tempted by all the things that came upon him to do something different. His own wife stood up for him and said, why don't you just curse God and die and be done with it? And he couldn't do it. It wasn't a rebellious act in him that he couldn't do it. He just knew that the nature of God is something different and he wouldn't be doing this. And he may even have thought God is not doing this, or I may be doing something wrong. You can read all the conversations in it. And he did have self-contemplation, but he kept coming back and going, I really don't know what's happening here, but if God sees fit for it to happen to me, then he is still good and gracious. And so the temptations that you and I are going to go through in our transformation as we learn things about the kingdom, try to implement those things, even if it looks like rule and regulation, and we follow through those things anyway, it's going to put us at odds with our culture to some degree. And that might be mom and dad, might mean all the friends that you've been around all your life. I'm not telling you, just draw a line and separate. It's not that easy. It's not that easy. It's difficult. But in the end, you're struggling with discerning what the kingdom is. And that's what happens through this temptation thing that he's talking about right here. And sometimes it's going to make you stand apart. Sometimes it's not real obvious how you stand or where you should stand in everyday life. And you have to, in the end, I mean, we just need to cut this off from here. Paul goes on with this dissertation talking about all the things he does that he could do, that he could claim, that he could stand up and go, this is my right. But in the end, in verse 33 at the bottom of this thing, he says, I do what's best for others over myself. Because in the beginning of all this, they were struggling with, well, I do this because that's what Paul does, and I do this because that's what Apollos does, and we've talked about that. And it turns out to start being selfish. You're trying to self-justify. And that is the condition that God puts us in front of, where we will sacrifice that at some point. And it's not a one-time thing. You do get better at it over time. And that's the picture of Job. All the things he had gone through, he was able to stay in the mindset that God is good, no matter what's happening. And if all that was going through for Job's purpose, God was just strengthening that through the temptation and the tragedies that he was enduring. And that's easy to look at that from 30,000 feet and come to this thing. But when you're going through it in the middle of it, that's a whole different thing. But Paul, looking at these people, he's basically chastising, well, he's not basically, he is, and he's frustrated with them because they're struggling with all this stuff and the questions they're answering. So you can't look at it and go, well, they ought to know this already. I don't really mean that that's his frustration. I'm saying he's frustrated because he's going, man, this is elementary stuff that you're fussing with. You're going to get into some real stuff before long. You need to rise up to that level of facing God in the face through the temptations. Quit looking at, if I do this, these temptations and these difficulties won't be coming. He's saying when those things are coming, turn and look at God and go, what are you showing me here? What do I need to learn? How do I need to stand up? And that's done through trepidation and difficulty a lot of times. But Paul's at a place where he can see what's transpiring there, and he's trying to encourage them. Pick up. Come on, let's go. So, I probably raved and ranted here probably more than I should have. Really like it a lot better when Matt's over here. But in terms of the ministry, my brain just shut off again. I knew that we were, nothing's really changed in terms of the things that we've been planning. So I know that we have some projects coming up at the church, and well, I don't even know what to tell you on that, and we'll have to catch back up to you or check the website. So Matt will never let me sit in the chair by myself again. So anyway, send us comments, like the podcast so that we can press this on a little further, and let us know. Put some stuff in there later on. You know, if you got questions on this or challenges on that, we're certainly not afraid to deal with any of that or to reevaluate what we're thinking in that regard. So anyway, y'all have a blessed day, and we'll be visiting with you later.